chatbots, if you type, as I was saying before the break, if you actually type into Google or a search engine, you're looking for something, you'll now see at the top of many of those, like Google, a response. But when you look above it, it says it's been generated by an AI chatbot. Now, an AI chatbot, according to this study, says they're more biased towards left-wing woke thinking in the information they provide to users. This is according to a pioneering study. If you ask the chatbot a political and policy question, they tend to be more negative about right-wing ideologies and politicians than left-wing alternatives. This has been published by the Centre for Policy Studies. On civil rights, if you ask them a question about civil rights, the chatbot tends to focus on hate speech rather than free speech. If you ask them an energy question, for example, they tend to highlight greenhouse gases rather than energy independence. So what is going on? Are they intrinsically biased? Is this in the programming? What's the answer? Well, joining me now is Emma Revell, who is External Affairs Director at the Centre for Policy Studies. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Do you know, I've only just realised recently that when I type stuff into Google, it comes up with that response. And then when you look, it says AI generated. I don't think many people realise that.
Yeah, I mean, if you talk about, AI and things like chatbots, 5-10 years ago, this was science fiction. There were scientists who thought it was possible and they were working very hard on it. But for most of the general public, this was sort of futuristic stuff. And now it's not even that you have to seek it out because, as you say, as Google have done with Gemini and as other services are doing, they're rolling it out automatically. It's, now a feature of other programs rather than something you have to seek out specifically. So I think it's important that we do keep interrogating these services and checking on the responses that they're giving us.
Well, I'm just deeply nervous, particularly about young people who take it at face value.
Well, yeah, I mean, especially if you look at where it's integrated to things like search engines or social media, X has its own AI within the system as well. Previously, if you searched for something, you would get pages and pages of responses, and yes, you were probably more likely to check on the top 3 links or the things that were on the first page, but you were served a range of options. The addition of AI, whether you're looking through an AI generated chat system specifically or one that's integrated into another service, they're giving you what feels like and can often be perceived as the sort of this is the definitive summation of the information. But actually, if not everything is being fed into that summation, it's not definitive.
So why do these chatbots tend to be left-leaning?
Well, I think it's very important to know that in our report, we go to the lengths to point out we don't think this is, a sort of a deliberate thing. It's not a conspiracy. It's about how the systems are designed and what goes into them. And it may just be that actually, if these AI systems are trained with, the information that's available on the internet, it may well be there's just a lot more left-leaning, policy discussions out there, and that's being fed through. But it's more a caution to developers to say, look, these tools are phenomenal. They can do an amazing range of things already, and what they will be able to do over the next sort of 3 to 5 years is, almost unfathomable, the opportunities that the AI will unlock. But we need to keep an eye on it and we need to be cautious. And ideally, the report says AI should be factual, it should be neutral. You should have all the information possible fed into the AI summaries of questions that are being asked, and it shouldn't be making a value judgment. It should say, well, some people think this and some people think that. And that's, one of the things to highlight. Specifically, when we asked it for policy recommendations, we asked very open-ended questions. What are policy recommendations in the area of housing or in the area of energy, for example? Very open-ended. But the results were coming back mainly from a left-leaning perspective. So not all of the range of possible policy recommendations were being included in the summaries that were being generated.
But I suppose the AI is also leaning on, say, for example, articles that have been published, and we know those sources tend to be politically aligned, so certain newspapers tend to lean left, some lean right. So is the point here that actually you need to take, in terms of reading that AI response from Google or wherever else, you need to also realise the source that it's drawn from, and that's very difficult to do.
It is, and I think that's something that we should, apply to anything we read on the internet. Really, you should always be thinking, well, what is the motivation of the person who's written this, or the website that it's presenting? I'm old enough to know I did my homework, partly from books and partly from the internet. And I remember being told, 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, even at school, you must think about your sources. You must critically analyze the information that's out there. And as, I imagine kids at school nowadays don't do half as much homework with books as I did. It's almost entirely internet-based sources. So thinking critically about where the information has come from, I think, is key.
I was talking to a friend of mine who's much younger than me, and he was saying that there are certain websites, for example, Ground News, where you can look at Ground News, you ask it a question, and it shows you all the sources, and it also shows you the degree of accuracy, whether it leans right or left. I'd never heard of it.
No, I mean, I'd never heard of it either. It's interesting that these sort of things are springing up in response to, studies like ours, which are not sort of implying there's any conspiracy, but just sort of waving a flag to say this is something we need to think about. And it is quite easy relatively easy, I suppose, for developers to keep fine-tuning these chatbots. We see new versions coming out all the time. So it is just saying, look, there is tuning that you could do as you train these chatbots and the next generation of the technology to prioritize fact-checking, to prioritize being neutral, rather than, taking an unbiased, a skewed perception of the information that's being fed into them.
And I suppose, finally, I should ask, were you surprised by the results?
Not particularly. I think there have been quite a few stories, looking at AI bias, and it's something that people have been concerned about. I think what was interesting is before, previous studies have sort of forced these machines to do an A or B choice, or a lot of the studies have been focused on America, where obviously you have issues like gun rights or abortion, things that are particularly politically charged in America but don't necessarily apply to other countries. We asked very open-ended questions and gave a lot of opportunity for quite lengthy responses, and yet, the left-leaning bias still did come through.
Fascinating stuff, Emma. Thanks ever so much for joining me. That's Emma Revell there, External Affairs Director at the Centre for Policy Studies. Keep all